Yes, I'll be happy to talk about the impact of the global, the ramification of the global markets volatility onto domestic food price inflation. But before getting into that, the first point I would like to raise is following up from what Ali was saying. We have to put this in broader perspective. If we think of imminent food crisis, we of course think of Ukraine, but we should also think of the situation in the Horn of Africa, where an imminent famine is there because of prolonged and repeated droughts. And that's not directly related to the ramifications of the invasion of Ukraine and its impacts on global markets. So it's good to put that into perspective. The second point I'd like to make, it's important to understand well how the international consequences are having an impact on domestic situations. And the managing director of the IMF said a few weeks ago that the war in Ukraine means hunger in Africa. Now, while that may be true, it's not a direct relationship. We need to understand well how that works, and through that also understand what would be the right policy responses. So if we go to the next slide, please. So first, it's good to see that food prices in international markets, but also to consumers around the world, were already up last year. So this is a heat map of consumer inflation as of February 22nd of this year, so just before the invasion in Ukraine. So already before that, we saw this map coloring red, and that was because also in international markets, as Jo's presentation showed, prices had already increased during last year, particularly because of the two-track recovery from the pandemic, the crisis caused by the pandemic, and particularly in developing countries not being able to produce enough food to meet increasing demand with the recovery. But also has to do with other factors that have to do with exchange rates, fiscal space, and for food subsidies, for which a lot of the developing countries have less capacity to respond to. When we go to the next slide, it's very clear here from, if you take it a year ago, then the map on the left is much lighter colored than on the right, which means much higher food inflation rates. But also at the beginning of last year, inflation rates were already up in several parts of the world, in part because of this two-track recovery I just mentioned. So what we need to do is to dig a little deeper into the specific causes and transmission mechanisms of what's happening in global markets. So we go to the next slide, please. So here's a framework to think about that. So on the left-hand side, we see shocks in the markets that directly related to the conflict because of the importance of particularly Russia and Ukraine for the production and exports of core commodities. And those effects could be exacerbated because of high oil prices and supply restrictions in fertilizer markets, increased cost of inputs. And we're seeing already trade restrictions, be it in the form of sanctions or be it in the form of actual restrictions posed by countries that could further exacerbate food price shocks. And I'll emphasize a bit these trade restrictions that are very important to consider, not just because of export bans that producing countries and food exporting countries may impose, and that will insulate their own populations from increased prices, but will be bad for everybody else. On the other hand, what we've seen from and we know from the crisis in 2008, 2009, and 2010, 2011, that many food importing countries then respond by lowering import tariffs on the food items to insulate their consumers, but that will drive up demand for food imports around the world if that happens on a large scale, and that then will further drive up food prices and exacerbating the shock we have. So we need to understand this dynamics well before we derive consequences for what it means for impacts at the country level. Then, of course, the vulnerabilities of countries will depend on how much they depend on imports of key staple foods, exchange rate, whether they have enough strength, macroeconomic strength to protect from further devaluations, particularly in food importing countries that could drive up the cost, the fiscal and other financial constraints that will determine to what extent countries are able to insulate their populations from the food price shocks, as well as, of course, the food production capacity inside the country and resilience to shocks like these, but also other shocks like weather shocks, as I mentioned in the beginning. So those elements may conspire against food security because of high vulnerability. And of course, as we'll see later on, impacts at the household level particularly tend to impact hardest on the poor, because they spend a lot more higher shares of their incomes on food items, and hence the food impacts will be bigger. But we have to weigh all these factors in order to understand how the global trends impact on domestic price increases. So here's some recent work that we have been doing together with my colleague David Laborde, and which provides you with a quick overview of the degrees and the different types of vulnerabilities that countries are exposed to. I just won't go over all the details here, but the first major conclusion is that we have to be very careful in differentiating the impacts on different countries. But what it shows here is that beyond the various types of exposures to either the conflict because of likely lower exports from Ukraine, Russia to certain food importing countries like Egypt, or direct exposure to export restrictions, and or that combined with low domestic stocks of grains are the ones that are immediately directly affected. I'd like to point at all the orange-colored countries on this map, which are basically the countries that are not that so much directly exposed to the impacts of the conflict in the Baltic Sea area, but rather because of the general food price increases and because of high share of food costs in consumption and in GDP and in import shares that are affecting these countries. And as you can see, these are a large number, probably the majority of the low and middle income countries. And here you can see how that may impact these different degrees of vulnerability. And here's one of the couple of the most affected countries. Let me just focus here on one of them, the kind of vulnerabilities we see a country like Yemen, which imports about 82% of their calories, of which 22% from Russia and Ukraine. The total calorie consumption at risk, be it because of the trade ties or because of the exposure to export restriction directly, indirectly, is 44%. And the increase just of the cost of wheat will increase the import bill of this country by almost 4% of GDP, which is an enormous impact for just a price shock for one single commodity. And that will come on top of already high domestic inflation. And what you cannot see well here, because it's a bit cut off here, but the food insecurity in Yemen, of course, are already very high, affecting about half of the population. We'll hear more about the Yemen situation later on. So here's what I said. So it's very clear the transmission effect and the impact on food security will also depend on income levels and existing food insecurity situation. But this is just to underline the point already raised, is that lower income countries as well as lower income households are much more vulnerable simply because they spend much more of their income on food. Go to the next slide. Here's one of the lessons learned from the past food price crisis, I'll just highlight two elements here. One is that at that time, the estimate was that the impact of the 2010-11 crisis, accounting for all the shocks plus the insulation measures that countries did, which is, you can see from the left-hand side, that the world market price impacts did not fully translate, maybe just for half of it, into domestic price inflation. But ending up into an increase across the world, but mostly affecting sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, of about an increase in number of food insecure people of about 8 million people, is about 1%. So that's significant enough, but it's also not as major as some news reports would like it to see. And also in this, that the adverse effect of certain insulation mechanisms, particularly the trade mechanisms, account for about 40% of the increase in food insecurity. Hence, the conclusion here is trade policy as an insulation measure is not a good device. On to the next slide, please. So there's some recent estimates, this quote by FAO. We're still looking at it ourselves, but largely we see a range of, in terms of moderate and severe impact scenarios of possible increased from what we know now of the crisis, increased in the number of undernourished people around the world of between 8 and 13 million people, just by looking at the impacts on wheat and maize prices, which is fairly similar to the impacts that we saw with the 2010-2011 crisis. But maybe more importantly is that the main impact is indirectly on what I called before the category 6 countries, the orange colored countries in the vulnerability map, meaning that the story is not just about wheat and about the Ukraine, but the indirect effects it has on global markets and mediated through the other vulnerability factors onto food insecurity around the world. Well, to my next and last slide, and I'll conclude with that. So what does it mean for thinking about policy implication in the short run? Very clearly, we should avoid using trade policies to insulate the impacts of this crisis for consumers, be it through export restrictions or through reducing tariffs on foods. And likely, we should ideally also avoid sanctions hitting food and fertilizers. If politically that would seem difficult to do, then at least we should have compensating measures, particularly by facilitating access of food importers to alternative suppliers. That's also not a given. And also allow facilitate usage of the still pretty ample available food reserves for exports to the most vulnerable countries. So that will require quite a bit of international coordination. Then to insulate the poor, it's very important that we countries, particularly with have to foot very high import bills, get balance of payment support and fiscal support in order to avoid having to recur to trade restrictions and trade measures to insulate population, but rather do it through social protection measures and support for international food aid for those countries that are in dire need of more direct food assistance. And then lastly, and that brings me back to my initial point, we have to look beyond the current crisis. We have more and better monitoring mechanisms in place, not just to be prepared to give the right answers and tailored answers to the present crisis, but also the future crisis and other crises as like what's happening now in the Horn of Africa, to be prepared. And we can only do that if we do that on a systematic basis, and that's what we're trying to work on and put in place at CGIAR and at IFPRI. So thank you very much, and apologies for taking more of my allotted time.
Thank you very much.